So one of the kind of most basic issues in promoting social change is that we come to form identities that that structure our lives and structure our relationships with others. And to get us to become self-critical of that is very threatening, is very challenging.
Being socialized within a particular society means to learn its norms and practices. As we internalize these patterns, we also begin to reproduce them in our everyday actions. Through this repetition, it becomes tempting to see these social arrangements as natural or inevitable. Today's guest, Sally Haslanger, challenges this assumption. In her work, she examines the many ways in which social subjects participate in reproducing the very structures that shape them, and why these patterns can be so difficult to break. At the same time, she argues that understanding how social structures are reproduced can also reveal how they might be transformed. So let's turn to Sally Haslanger and ask, why do we reproduce social structures, and how can we change them?
Hi, everybody. My name is Sally Haslanger. I'm a professor of philosophy in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. I also teach in Women's and Gender Studies, and I teach in D-Lab, which is a group at MIT that works to promote equity in under-resourced communities. Okay, so societies reproduce themselves, right? We, have, German culture, German society, or, British society persists over time. And the question is, how does it persist over time, right? The norms, the expectations, the values, the governmental structures, all of those things persist over time. So how does it do that? So there is one broad question about how societies sustain themselves. But there's a narrower question that socialist feminists have been interested in, which is, how is it that individuals become social agents? All right, so think of it this way. We are human beings. We're born and we have human dispositions and capabilities. But you're not a social agent until you're able to begin to speak a language and interpret those around you in your social milieu. So that is a social agent. An infant is a kind of proto-social agent because they are interacting with siblings and parents and nurses and all of that sort of thing. But they're not full social agents. They don't have social fluency. So it's kind of like learning a language. If you want to say, okay, you're going to develop fluency in English, that's to develop a set of dispositions and practices and abilities that enable you to speak fluently. And we as social agents develop over time to be able to interpret each other, respond to each other, make sense of our surroundings, and move through those surroundings in a way that is fluent. So when you say that, well, someone isn't quite socially fluent, that means that they're kind of uncomfortable and make mistakes in the social domain. And this is very common when you go to a new culture, right? I've made terrible mistakes going to another culture where, I just was behaving what seemed normal to me, but to the locals was anything but normal. So, for example, I'd visited India and I was sitting on the floor, everyone was sitting on the floor, and my back got tired. And so I stretched my legs out in front of me to, allow them to get a little bit of relief from sitting cross-legged. And I pointed the soles of my feet at the host. This was thought to be a horrible, disrespectful move. You don't do something like that. But they would forgive me because they knew I wasn't socially fluent in that particular culture. But if one of the members of their culture had done that, they would have been ostracized or punished or, some subtle ways looked down on. Okay, so social reproduction in the socialist feminist sense is how do we become fluent social agents? That's different from how does society reproduce itself, though it's going to be related to that. Okay, so as a matter of fact, women do most of the work of social reproduction. So women give birth to the babies, nurse them, care for them. They provide that early childhood support for them. They go to school. Most school teachers are women. They are provided health care, often by nurses and pediatricians, many of whom are women. So you end up getting this picture where so much of the work of daily life that enables social fluency and sustains it over time is done by women. So even kinship ties, women tend to be the ones responsible for maintaining kinship ties. They're the ones that are maintain certain kinds of relations with neighbors and others in the social milieu. And so this kind of social reproduction was brought up by socialist feminists because Marxians who spend so much time thinking about modes of production have lost track that all the modes of production depend on social reproduction to get to the point where we have a worker who can get up in the morning and go to work and do the work in the factory, et cetera, make the commodity, et cetera, and then go home and have the support and the care that is provided by women in the home.
To further clarify how social subjects reproduce societies, Sally Haslanger introduces an important conceptual distinction. She argues that every culture is structured by social meanings that shape how individuals make sense of the world they live in. She refers to these underlying frameworks of meaning as schemas. At the same time, there are things to which these meanings assign value, which she calls resources. Haslanger now suggests that particular practices are established around the ways social agents organize what is taken to have value.
So as we become social agents, we learn a variety of social meanings about what means what. So what you will find when you are interacting a lot with families with infants, that at least in the US, people mark their infants with colors, baby pink and baby blue, so that they can signal to people what pronouns to use. Because, we have he pronouns and she pronouns, and people find it uncomfortable to refer to infants as its, and because that means an object, and they feel like they need to use a personal pronoun, but they can't tell the sex of the baby because they're just this little bald, round-faced thing in the carriage. And so if you mark the baby with pink or blue, then someone can say, "Oh, she's beautiful," blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that is the sort of thing that counts as a social meaning. Pink means girl, blue means boy, but they're all over the place, right? So you enter a classroom and you have a set of seats, and then you have a podium at the front with a blackboard behind it. There's social meanings all over that space. If you're going as the speaker, you know immediately where to walk. If you're going as a member of the audience, you know where to sit, what to do, etc. So architecture is another thing that signals to us what our proper role is, how we ought to behave, etc. Okay, so let's stick for the moment with the example of a lecture or a classroom. So in a classroom, there's a set of practices that we're engaged in. I mentioned before that who's teaching, who's learning, how you're teaching and learning. But let's imagine just going to a lecture with a speaker and an audience. So I'm interested in the idea that practices are ways of coordinating around things of value. So you think about a lecture. What is of value that is being distributed in that context? Well, ideally, it's going to be knowledge or something of interest or worth considering or pursuing. Now, how do we organize ourselves to share that? How do we coordinate to make that resource available? Well, if we all just go in there and start talking and sort of wandering around, etc., you're not going to get the same value of that resource that you might if you have it more organized. So you get an expert in, the expert is given some space and some time. Everybody else is given opportunities to listen. Knowledge, ideally, is being distributed. You get some question and answer time so that the knowledge that is supposed to be delivered, you could say, well, maybe I didn't understand it. Maybe it wasn't clear enough, etc. So that there's a sub-practice of this larger practice of the Q&A, of people trying to probe and ask questions and get there and enable their ideas to be presented to the whole group. And so this is a practice that coordinates us around the resource of knowledge, the resource of interest or curiosity or something like that. But then you start looking around and there are all kinds of resources that we might distribute. So much more concretely and more mundanely, the distribution of food. Now, food is something of value. We need it. We depend on it. But there are lots of different ways to distribute it. Just take a kind of silly example of think about the scheduling of meals. So in some places, like in the US, there's a background assumption that there are 3 meals a day. There's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Okay, we're going to distribute we're going to coordinate to distribute things in that way. So you get school lunches. Okay, there's a particular time of day that you're going to get school lunch, and you're going to know sort of what is the parameters for school lunch. And then you're going to say, okay, you only had a light meal in the middle of the day, so you go home and have your big meal at evening, like that. So parents can plan about what they're going to provide to their children in the evening because they know they didn't have a big lunch in the middle of the day. But in other places, in other countries, the big meal is the middle of the day meal, and the evening meal is just a light snack, something like that. And so this is a way to coordinate sort of who's going to get fed what, when, and what else needs to be done. So parents, it's helpful for parents to know what children are going to get during the day, and it's helpful for the school to know what children are going to get in the evening. So that's a coordination. But it also is opening of restaurants. When are the restaurants open? What do they serve at different times of day? You go to a restaurant at 7 in the morning, and they're not going to serve you steak and fries, right? Because that's not breakfast food. That's not what we eat in the morning. What we eat are eggs and toast or, croissant or a nice piece of bread with some lovely spread on it or jam, something like that. And so the restaurants are now participating in the system of coordination around the distribution of food. Okay, so there are these practices. I can then ask you, would you want to have lunch? Now, it used to be, interestingly, in English, that lunch was a light meal at any time of day or night. So if I said, you want to have lunch? I could mean, do you want to have a snack at 11 p.m.? That's what it might mean. That's very hard to coordinate around, lunch. Do you want to have a light snack anytime? Now we say, do you want to have lunch? There's a kind of window of time. We kind of know it's going to be a light meal. It's not going to be a huge meal. It's going to be roughly in the middle of the day when you get to take a break from work. So the schema is the frame of interpretation and the patterns that enable us to coordinate, and the resources is what we are coordinating around. So in the lecture, we're coordinating around knowledge, and we have figured out a way to do it reasonably effectively. In the case of lunch, we have this background social meaning of what lunch is as opposed to breakfast or dinner. And then we're coordinating around the distribution of food. And in the case of lunch, very often it's the distribution of, conversational opportunities and sort of social time and things like that. So this is something to keep note of, that there can be more than one resource that's being distributed in a particular practice. And I think that's very much true in the case of lunch.
Now, Sally Haslanger argues that social structures are reproduced through the interplay between schemas and resources. Social meanings shape how we understand particular resources, while those resources and the ways they are organized in turn structure how they can be interpreted. Haslanger describes this reciprocal dynamic of mutual influence as looping. She exemplifies this mutual reinforcement with the example of a bunny whose role as a resource varies depending on the social meanings assigned to it.
Imagine that you have a bunny running around, hopping away through the meadow, and you can interpret that bunny in a variety of different ways, as a wild animal, as potential food, as a potential pelt or clothing. You could skin it and wear it as clothing, or as a pet. And so the schemas of wild animal, pet, food, whatever, are available to you as a way to interpret the bunny. And as you interpret the bunny in that way, it becomes a resource, which is something of positive or negative value. So as a pet, has the potential value of being something that, comforts you in your home and you play with, etc. And so if you were to interpret it that way, then you might breed it to become less fearful of humans, to become fat and lazy, to live in a cage and not complain about that. And then that will reinforce the idea that bunnies are pets. Now, on the other hand, if you interpret it as food, then what happens is that you kill the bunny and you serve it, but then there develops this kind of taste for rabbit meat. And so then that taste for rabbit meat develops a cuisine and a whole elaborate set of recipes that then reinforces this idea that bunnies are for food, and so they're bred in order to become tasty and have the right kind of meat. And so what schemas you use to interpret the world guide our interaction with the world and change what the world is like to conform to the schemas that we bring to it. So I think that this is sometimes looping in the case of real estate or neighborhoods. So if you have a neighborhood that is, say, a poor neighborhood, and you interpret it as a place that's dangerous, right, that neighborhood, then there's going to be effects on that neighborhood about what happens to people who live in that neighborhood. So it might be that there's more police presence in that neighborhood. And if there's more police presence, there are likely to be more arrests. And then that reinforces the idea that it's dangerous. Now, if you have another neighborhood that's not as interpreted as dangerous, maybe there's just as much crime in that neighborhood, but there isn't the kind of police presence, and so you don't have the number of arrests, so it doesn't reinforce the idea, that it is dangerous. People don't even think of it as dangerous. And so this goes back to some of the issues about structural racism, is that sometimes if you just rely on data about violence, what you'll find is it correlates with where police presence is, because police presence sort of is documenting violence in a way that in another neighborhood it might not document violence. And so the interpretation of something as a violent neighborhood may be partly an artifact of whether it's thought to be a violent neighborhood, and then there's police presence in that neighborhood that sort of gathers data to support that, when in fact another neighborhood, say a white neighborhood, may be violent, maybe violence in a different way, it may be domestic violence, etc., etc.
Now, Haslanger argues that understanding why social subjects reproduce social structures requires more than pointing to fear of sanctions or coercion. While such pressures matter, individuals must also be shaped into subjects who identify with the roles assigned to them. To explain this, she draws on the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser and his concept of interpellation. Through socialization, individuals are recognized within categories of meaning that assign them social roles. Because these roles become part of their identities, they are internalized and difficult to challenge.
Interpellation is a kind of technical term that comes from Althusser and his work on ideology and ideological state apparatuses. And Althusser is interested in two ways that you can get people to perform practices. One is by coercion. And so this was a kind of repressive state apparatus that is going to force you to do certain things so that you'll be arrested or held accountable if you don't do it. But ideological state apparatuses are ones that you don't need coercion in order to get people to perform them. And this, I interpret, is connected to things that Foucault talks about when he talks about docile bodies in Discipline and Punish. So discipline, as opposed to punishment in Foucault, is very connected to what I think Althusser is talking about in his ideology and ideological state apparatuses. In Discipline and Punish, for example, Foucault distinguishes the practices of discipline where when you discipline a child, you're not just swatting them when they do something wrong, which is punishment. What you're doing is trying to scaffold their learning about how to engage in a particular practice. You're scaffolding their learning of piano, for example. And you say, okay, you have to practice piano 30 minutes a day, and then 45 minutes a day, and then an hour a day, to develop the self-discipline so that they will come to know that this is what they have to do in order to become a good piano player. And it's not punishment. What you're doing is making these practice periods required of them in order for them to develop certain kinds of skills. So in Althusser and in Foucault, the idea is that we are disciplined as social agents to perform certain tasks and to fulfill certain expectations. And what's crucial about an ideological state apparatus is that we get to the point where we don't need an external coercive force in order to keep us doing it, because we do it to ourselves. So if you have been disciplined properly as a musician, you don't need someone to threaten you with punishment if you don't practice, because you feel like, oh my God, I need to practice. I need to do this. This is something that I am asking myself to do. It's not just that someone from the outside is asking me to do it. So when we start talking about discipline and interpellation and why ideological state apparatuses are so important, is what they're doing is getting that pressure to conform to come from within rather than to come from without, right? And that is where ideology has its home, because ideology in this tradition isn't just a bunch of justifications that we share with each other to show that the state is right or that this or that practice is right. That's a conception of ideology or explicit ideology, like neoliberal ideology or liberal ideology or conservative ideology. That's a way of thinking about ideology as this explicit discourse. But in this tradition, the ideology is going to be what you have internalized and come to adopt as a form of self-criticism and self-regulation so that you perform the task and you perform it and hold yourself to standards. Okay, so if you're interpellated as a good student, you don't need the threat of failing in order to do your homework. You say, oh my gosh, I haven't yet done my homework. I better go do my homework. And then you run off and do your homework. Or if you're interpellated as a mom, You don't need to have the threat of someone saying, oh, you better get your kid to school or you're going to be punished or something. No, you think, oh my gosh, I'm a good mom. I'm going to get my kid to school, or I'm going to get my kid to the doctor, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a way of becoming a social agent and being a self-regulating social agent, because you have been interpolated as that kind of social agent.
Building on these conditions of social reproduction, Haslanger now outlines what makes practices and structures durable. She identifies 3 main factors that contribute to their persistence: the ways practices stabilize our identities and make us intelligible to others, the distribution of value and power that structures behavior, and the material and organizational conditions that shape what is possible.
So remember, structures are built on relations that are built on practices. Okay, so we are interpolated to play a certain role in these practices, and we come to identify with that role, and we self-regulate to be good at that role. Okay, so there are a couple things going on here. One is that process of interpolation makes it seem as though this is what we want. This is how we realize ourselves as agents. And so one of the pressures that comes when you're trying to change the social structure is you're trying to say to people, you know, that way that you do that practice that you're invested in, we're going to ask you to change your way of doing that. We're going to ask you to change the kinds of relationships that you stand in and the role that you're playing. But the whole point of interpolation is that you identify with that role and that you take it on as appropriate for yourself. So one of the kind of most basic issues in promoting social change is that we come to form identities that structure our lives and structure our relationships with others. And to get us to become self-critical of that is very threatening, is very challenging. And there are 2 additional things that are relevant here. One is that the schemas allow us to make sense of things in the world, make sense of ourselves, and make sense of others. So if I start doing something that's really not in keeping with the practice, so even if I, as a teacher, start saying, okay, we're going to mix these tables up and we're going to not have you all facing me. We're going to put you in a big circle. And now I'm going to have so-and-so lead the discussion. People are going, what is going on here? They find it very uncomfortable and they're very confused, especially at the beginning, because they are expecting me to run things, for example. And so if they're put in the position of running something, they're not going to want to do it, right? Because they don't feel as though they have any rules for how to do it, or they have the experience. They haven't been interpolated into that role. Okay, so another maybe more helpful example would be if you're someone who's non-binary and you start to dress and behave in a non-binary way, so you're not man or woman, then the question is, the issue is that people will come up to you and not know what pronouns to use or not know how to interact with you, whether they're supposed to embrace you, kiss both cheeks, whatever they're supposed to do. They're not sure what the norms are because you aren't intelligible to them. But we really want to be intelligible to others because we want to belong. Belonging is a very deep need that humans have. And so veering away from the normative expectations about the practices that you've identified with is very scary because you aren't intelligible to others and it's very confusing to other people. And so that's disruptive and uncomfortable. And then the third thing is resources. We structure our material world to support certain kinds of practices. So the material conditions, I brought up the case of the lecture hall. So in a lecture hall, we structure a lecture hall to cue people to perform certain kinds of practices. And so, to try and do anything different in a lecture hall that's on a banked lecture hall, it's going to be impossible to do it. What do you do in such a lecture hall? So the material conditions are going to be important for sort of keeping certain patterns in place. Now, let me give you another example. So food. If you're from a culture that is used to eating things made of chickpea flour, for example, in India, and then you come to the US, it's very hard to find things that are made of chickpea flour. And so you'll start conforming your diet to making things with wheat flour. Now there's a kind of rigidification of a set of practices about what we eat and how we eat and what is available that is totally material, right? You can't make the kinds of food that you're used to making because the materials aren't available. And so material conditions are going to be a huge factor that stabilize a set of practices. Schemas and tools for interpretation are going to be really important because that's how we are intelligible to each other. And just the fact that we have been interpolated into practices and come to identify with them and place our sense of self in our roles, that's going to be another one.
So far, Haslanger has examined the various ways in which social agents and groups reproduce social structures. She now argues that understanding these dynamics of reproduction can also help us identify possibilities for emancipatory social change. For Haslanger, a key element of such change lies in building what she calls chapter-based movements.
It's very hard to disrupt social or societal reproduction to change society because of the various considerations I just mentioned. It's also hard because if you just try to do it as an individual, you're going to be unintelligible or ostracized or ignored or pathologized or something like that. And so the first step is to work with others, to build a movement is the way I think of it. And this movement doesn't have to be nationwide or something. If you're in the philosophy department and you're struggling with a certain set of policies or norms in the department, then just try to reach out to others who are perhaps suffering from the same circumstances and work with them to identify what's really at stake, what's really wrong, what might be changed. So social movements can be very small. They can be 3 people. They don't have to be 10,000 people. But the idea is to move first from your experience of the problem to seeing if there are others who are experiencing similar problems or similar challenges, and then together trying to figure out what are the background circumstances or structures that are constraining you or confining you in the way that you feel is wrong or unjust or unfair. So then once you've got a critical mass of people, then there are a couple, depending on how big a movement it is, but there are different strategies for what to do next. I think that these small, what I call chapters, in a particular structure can make a difference by raising the issue in the collective in some way. But that's not always going to be effective because very often the people who are most affected by this injustice or wrong are going to be easily marginalized or maybe are already marginalized and so can be pushed further to the margins. So it often turns out that it's important to build solidarity across sites. So this is an idea of a chapter-based movement. And chapter-based movements take individuals who are marginalized in one setting and link them to people who are suffering similar problems or issues in another setting. And then they can compare and contrast, but also be super sensitive to the situated circumstances and the situated knowledge that's available in their milieu. So if one of them is struggling because they're not being taken seriously, they reach out to the other one for validation that no, it's not just you are crazy. This is something that is broader and more systemic in the structure, right? So you start to see how the structure is instantiated in these very different places. And so it's much more difficult to be totally marginalized if you can affirm with others who are similarly situated that this is a problem that they're facing too. So one of the crucial things about chapter-based movements is that they are grounded in the specific circumstances of their milieu, and they have a very fine-grained analysis of what's going on there, and that understanding is crucial. But they also have this broader structural idea of how it's replicated in different places and in different ways. And so then that collective knowledge that you get from that can be used to leverage a campaign, to leverage a sort of consciousness raising or educational programs and such like that, that then can potentially move the movement forward. And if that doesn't work, then what you start to do is protest, right? You start to use other techniques of boycotts and protests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once you start that kind of disruptive direct action, then it's good to have a network, because then you can pool your resources to hire a lawyer or to hire someone who can help manage messaging or something like that. So what you find in broad social movement work is that chapter-based movements are really the most effective. There's actual empirical research on this, because they have the advantages of insight into the specific milieu, the specific situation, but also the support and the broad vision that comes from these alliances and partnerships across the chapters.
Social change is often understood in terms of legal reform and political institutions. Haslanger argues against this, that both of these approaches have their limitations because they often fail to transform the underlying social practices and meanings that sustain the existing structures.
Let's talk about the limitations of law and politics. So as we've discussed already, the social norms and social meanings and such are not always formal. They're not always written down as policy. They're not always enforced coercively by law. And in fact, though that level of coercive structuring has effects, but it only has limited effects, because people are going to live their lives and they will ignore the law or ignore a policy, or they will reinterpret it in ways that are better suited to the practices they're comfortable with. And so what you find, so a very famous example in the United States is Brown v. Board of Education, which was a desegregation law in the 50s. There were Supreme Court decision in 54 and 55 that said that school districts had to desegregate and allow Black and white children to go to school together. And this wasn't even started to be implemented for 7-8 years. And it took much more effort and legislation to fine-tune how it would be implemented, because you can tell people, okay, there's this Supreme Court decision and there's this new law and whatever, and people go, so what? We're going to continue. In fact, what's interesting is that in Virginia, there were school districts that closed the public schools rather than desegregate. right? So they find ways around the law. And why is that? Because the practices are entrenched. The social meanings are entrenched. The form of life is entrenched. The identification with different roles is entrenched. And it's not entrenched by law, it's entrenched by social norms, social values, social meanings, and such like that. So you see, for example, in Arkansas, these situations where, Black children were sent to school, and you have white crowds that are shouting and trying to prevent them from going into the school. And this is a child who is just carrying her school books and trying to walk up the steps of the school. But the meaning of a Black child going into a white classroom is so powerful and so intense that they are happy to break the law and do violence, in fact, rather than have that sort of happen in their neighborhood, in their school district. And so the reason I think philosophers and poets and artists and others can be so much more powerful is that they have the power to change social meanings. They have the power to disrupt social norms. And those are really, really what holds so much of our social life, in place. Because it's those schemas that are telling us how to interpret things and to identify things of value and disvalue. That's where things really matter to us. And law, yeah, it's important because you don't want to be punished for doing various things, but it doesn't shape our lives in the same sort of way. So we need to work at these informal levels and work in organizing to disrupt those norms, to disrupt those forms of life in order to get really lasting social change. So this is a bit of a dated example, but back in the 60s and 70s in the United States, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, for example, was not considered an assault. So that there was a very, very rigid line between public and private. So if there was an assault outside of your house, you were heading home and you were assaulted, the police would come and the perpetrator would be arrested and taken away. If you walked into your house and the same thing happened by your intimate partner, by your husband, the police wouldn't touch it. They would say, sorry, a man's home is his kingdom or whatever. We can't touch it. It's a private affair. Okay, so the feminist movement at the time worked very hard to ask the question, why should the same behavior that happens by a stranger outside your door and happens by a partner inside the house be treated differently? Isn't assault assault? And this was a way of challenging this public-private distinction and showing that the public-private distinction was systematically used to relieve men of responsibility for their wrongdoing in their families. And so the same would be true of violence against children, like beating of children. He's the father. He gets to do this sort of thing. This other person outside, the teacher, not the father, right, doesn't get to. And so this breakdown of the public-private distinction that protected men in their homes from ordinary laws of assault, laws of rape, et cetera, that was broken down as feminists pointed out that assault is assault. Rape is rape. You can't make these fallacious distinctions between the private and the public actions that really fall under the same definition.